spring of 1877 came late to Sagebrush Crossing, a dusty settlement hugging the banks of the Platte River in Wyoming Territory. The cottonwoods were just beginning to show their pale green leaves, and the earth, cracked from winter frost, exhaled warm breath that mixed with the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the steady clip-clop of horses on the main street. Caleb Ward emerged from Murphy's General Store, a 50-pound sack of flour balanced on his broad shoulder and a coil of rope in his other hand. At 30 years old, he was a man shaped by the harsh requirements of cattle work, tall and solid, with shoulders permanently bent forward from years of leaning into the wind on horseback. His face, weathered beyond his years, rarely showed expression, as if the red buttes and endless grasslands had taught him their own language of silence. He loaded his supplies onto the buckboard wagon, movements efficient and practiced. Around him, the town stirred with its usual morning activity. Women in calico dresses gossiping outside the milliner's shop, cowboys lounging against the saloon's hitching post, and children darting between the buildings like prairie dogs. Caleb noticed none of it. He had learned long ago to keep his eyes on his own business. At the water pump near the town well, Mrs. Sarah Carver stood with her daughter, filling their water buckets for the journey ahead. The Carvers were heading north, part of the endless stream of families seeking their fortune in the territories. Mrs. Carver, a woman worn thin by frontier life, kept a firm grip on her daughter's hand as she worked the pump handle. 8-year-old Eliza Carver was small for her age, with hair the color of prairie grass in autumn, tied back with a faded blue ribbon that had seen better days. She watched Caleb with the unblinking intensity that only children possess, her bright eyes following his every movement as if trying to solve a puzzle. There was something in her gaze, not the typical childhood curiosity, but a strange, almost adult determination. "Stop staring, Eliza," her mother scolded gently. "It's not polite." But Eliza didn't look away. She had been watching the quiet cowboy since they'd arrived in town 3 days ago. She'd seen him help old Mr. Henderson fix his wagon wheel without being asked, seen him leave a package of supplies on the widow Morrison's doorstep before dawn, seen the way he gentled a spooked horse with just a low murmur and a steady hand. As Caleb walked past on his way to check his horses, Eliza pulled free from her mother's grasp and stepped directly into his path. He stopped, looking down at the child with mild surprise, the first emotion anyone had seen cross his face in days. "Mister," she said, her small voice clear and steady. "My name is Eliza." Caleb touched the brim of his hat slightly. "Miss?" he acknowledged, his voice rough from disuse. Before her mother could call her back, Eliza did something that would become legend in Sagebrush Crossing. She stood on her tiptoes, quick as a hummingbird, and pressed a kiss to Caleb's weathered cheek. Then, looking him straight in the eye with all the solemnity an 8-year-old could muster, she spoke words that rang out in the morning air. At 8, she kissed the cowboy by the river and said, "Wait for me." The words hung between them like a promise carved in stone. Several townspeople had witnessed the scene. Mrs. Murphy from behind her store window, the minister's wife fetching water, 2 cowboys who'd paused in their conversation. Some chuckled at the child's boldness, others shook their heads at such forward behavior, but Caleb didn't laugh. He studied the little girl's face as if memorizing it, then spoke in his low, gravelly voice. "Promises carry weight in this country, little one. They can last a lifetime. You sure you want to make one?" Eliza nodded solemnly. "I'm sure. You're good and kind. I seen it. And I'm gonna come back when I'm grown." "Mrs." Carver finally reached them, face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. Mr. Ward, Eliza, what's gotten into you?" She tugged her daughter back. "She reads too many stories, gets fanciful notions." "No harm done, ma'am," Caleb said, but his eyes remained on Eliza. "Safe travels to you." That afternoon, the Carver family loaded their possessions onto their wagon, a few pieces of furniture, barrels of provisions, and the dreams of a better life somewhere in the vast territory. Mr. James Carver, a thin man with the perpetual optimism of those who haven't yet been broken by the frontier, talked excitedly about the land they'd claim, the crops they'd grow. "Children forget quickly," he told his wife as they prepared to leave. "By next week, she won't even remember this town." But Eliza clutched her blue ribbon tight, her eyes fixed on the tall figure of Caleb Ward standing in front of the livery stable, as their wagon rolled out of town, following the rutted trail that paralleled the Platte River. She turned in her seat and waved until the bend in the river swallowed both the town and the cowboy from view. The other children in the wagon, her brothers Tommy and James Jr., were already fighting over a toy soldier. But Eliza sat quietly, one small hand pressed against the spot where she'd kissed the cowboy's cheek, as if sealing the memory there. As evening fell over Sagebrush Crossing, Caleb Ward stood on the porch of his ranch house 5 miles outside town. The house was too large for one man, built years ago with hopes that had withered like grass in drought. The long dining table inside had 8 chairs, but only one showed signs of use, its wood polished smooth by solitary meals. He could hear the wind moving through the grasslands, carrying the scent of sage and the distant howl of coyotes. On the mantel, his father's old pendulum clock ticked away the seconds with mechanical persistence, marking time in a life that had settled into unchanging routine. Wake before dawn, check the cattle, mend the fences, eat alone, sleep alone, repeat. But tonight, something was different. The child's words echoed in the empty rooms like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples through the carefully maintained silence of his existence. "Wait for me," she had said, with such certainty it might have been prophecy. Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter as always, and sat in his usual chair. Outside, the first stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. He thought about promises, how they could sustain a man or destroy him, how they were sometimes all that stood between civilization and chaos in this unforgiving land. He had made promises before, to his father, to stay and work the ranch, to himself, to never depend on anyone else for happiness. Those promises had shaped him into the man he was: reliable, solitary, expecting nothing from tomorrow except more of the same. But a child's promise, that was something else entirely. Children didn't understand the weight of years, the way hope could turn to dust in your hands. And yet, there had been something in those bright eyes, something that reminded him of the first green shoots pushing through snow, fragile but determined. Caleb finished his coffee and prepared for bed, following the same routine he'd kept for years. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around him with familiar creaks and sighs, he found himself thinking not of tomorrow's chores, but of a little girl with a faded blue ribbon and a promise too big for her small shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds racing across the yard like restless spirits. The land was teaching its harsh lessons to another family moving north. Just as it had taught him, most would break under the weight of those lessons. Some would grow hard as leather. A precious few would somehow keep that spark of hope alive despite everything. As sleep finally took him, Caleb Ward allowed himself one moment of wonder, not belief. Just wonder at what kind of woman that determined little girl might become. If the frontier didn't break her first, the promise hung in the air like a single star in an endless sky, small but stubbornly bright, waiting to see if time would make it true or merely another ghost story told around campfires on cold Wyoming nights. 10 years had passed like seasons of drought and flood across the Wyoming territory. The calendar showed 1887, but time in the West was better measured by scars on the land, on the cattle, on the men who worked them. Caleb Ward bore his share of those scars, visible and hidden, accumulated through countless brandings, bitter winters, and the peculiar loneliness that came from choosing solitude over the risk of loss. The Ward Ranch had prospered in its quiet way. The original homestead had grown to encompass nearly 1,000 acres of good grazing land, with water rights that made neighbors envious. Caleb had built his herd carefully, choosing quality over quantity. And his reputation for honest dealing meant buyers sought him out each fall. He employed 3 hands during peak season, good men who appreciated steady work and a boss who didn't talk much but paid fair wages on time. At 40, Caleb moved with the controlled economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy. And wasted energy could mean death when a blizzard caught you 10 miles from shelter. His hair, once dark as coffee, now showed gray at the temples like frost on autumn grass. The deep lines around his eyes came from squinting into countless sunrises, searching for strays or threats on the horizon. The West itself had changed. The railroad had pushed through 5 years back, bringing with it a flood of newcomers who didn't understand that this land demanded respect, not conquest. Towns sprang up overnight around water stops, some thriving, others withering as quickly as they'd bloomed. Sagebrush Crossing had survived and grown, now boasting a bank, a school, and even a small hotel for travelers. With progress came problems. Rustlers had grown bolder, sometimes taking 50 head in a single night. Range wars flared between established ranchers and newcomers who didn't comprehend that in this dry country. Water rights were more precious than gold. The law had arrived in the form of town marshals and circuit judges, but justice still often came from the barrel of a gun. Caleb rose before dawn, as always. The pre-morning darkness familiar as an old coat. Coffee boiled on the stove while he pulled on boots worn smooth by stirrups. Outside, the horses nickered softly in the corral, their breath steaming in the cool air. He moved through his morning routine, checking the animals, inspecting the fences, scanning the horizon for trouble with the mechanical precision of a decade's practice. The house remained much as it had been. Though cleaner than most bachelor establishments, Caleb had learned domestic skills out of necessity. He could patch clothes, cook a decent meal, and keep the place orderly. But the empty chairs around the dining table still mocked him during solitary suppers, and the spare bedroom he'd maintained dusted weekly. Bed made with fresh sheets monthly stood as a monument to hopes he couldn't quite abandon. In town, people spoke of Caleb Ward with the mixture of respect and wariness reserved for forces of nature. He helped when needed, showing up with his tools when a barn needed raising or his gun when rustlers threatened. But he attended no dances, courted no women, and politely declined invitations to Sunday dinners. The eligible ladies of Sagebrush Crossing had long since given up their attempts to catch his eye. Too set in his ways. Mrs., Murphy would say, shaking her head. Some men just aren't meant for domesticity. Too particular. Others would whisper, waiting for something that don't exist. They didn't know about the blue ribbon he'd found years ago, caught on a sage bush along the river road. Faded, but unmistakable. He'd picked it up with hands that trembled slightly, then folded it carefully and placed it in his father's Bible, marking a page he never read but sometimes touched. The newcomers brought new troubles. Silas Boone had arrived 3 years ago with money from back east and ambitions as big as the territory itself. He'd bought the old Patterson spread and immediately set about expanding, using methods that skirted the edge of legal. Boone understood that in the changing West, paper could be as powerful as bullets. He filed claims on water sources, bought up notes on struggling farms, and always seemed to know when someone was desperate enough to sell cheap. Boone had approached Caleb twice about buying the Ward Ranch. The first time, Caleb had simply said no. The second time, Boone had mentioned how unfortunate accidents could befall a man working alone, how rustlers seemed to know which ranches had the fewest hands. Caleb had set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked Boone in the eye until the older man shifted uncomfortably. My land's not for sale, Caleb had said quietly. Won't be tomorrow. Won't be next year. Best you understand that now. Boone had left, but Caleb knew the matter wasn't finished. Men like Boone viewed the world as a series of obstacles to overcome or own. The fact that Caleb's ranch controlled access to one of the best year-round water sources in the area made it a prize worth pursuing. Late one autumn night, Caleb was awakened by the sound of horses. He rolled out of bed, Winchester in hand before his feet hit the floor. Through the window, he saw riders, 4 of them, near his corral. The moon was new, offering little light, but he knew the silhouettes didn't belong to any of his hands. He slipped out the back door, moving through shadows with the skill of someone who'd learned to hunt as a child. The intruders were working at the corral gate, trying to spook his horses out onto the range where they could be gathered later. Rustlers, or worse, men sent to cause enough trouble that he'd be forced to sell. Caleb fired into the air, the rifle's report shockingly loud in the still night. "Next one won't be a warning," he called out. The men scattered like coyotes, mounting up and riding hard toward the property line. Caleb held his position until the hoofbeats faded, then spent the rest of the night on watch. Come morning, he found tracks leading back toward the Boone spread, though proving anything would be impossible. Word of the attempted rustling spread through town. Marshal Amos Pike, a former cavalry officer who'd kept his military bearing and sense of duty, rode out to investigate. He was one of the few lawmen who understood that keeping peace meant preventing trouble, not just responding to it. "Could have been anybody," Pike said, studying the tracks. "Drifters, maybe." "Maybe," Caleb agreed, both men understanding what wasn't being said. "A man alone makes an easy target," Pike observed carefully. "Might consider taking on more hands, or maybe finding yourself a wife. Amazing how troublemakers tend to leave family men alone." Caleb almost smiled at that. "I'll keep it in mind, Marshal." But he didn't hire more men, and he didn't start attending social functions. Instead, he reinforced his doors, kept his weapons clean and loaded, and slept light. The Ward Ranch had become a fortress of one, defended by stubbornness and steady aim. Winter came early that year, November snow falling thick and fast. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, ensuring his cattle had shelter and feed. His hands had gone to their own families for the season, leaving him truly alone. The isolation pressed in with the weather. Silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat during the long nights. One evening, tending to a sick calf in the barn, he found himself talking to the animal. "You picked a hell of a time to get poorly," he muttered, rubbing liniment into its legs. "Though I suppose there's never a good time for trouble." The calf looked at him with large, trusting eyes, and Caleb felt something twist in his chest. This was what his life had become: conversations with animals, an empty house, and the weight of defending what was his against men who viewed kindness as weakness. As he walked back to the house through falling snow, he caught himself looking down the road toward town, almost expecting to see a wagon approaching. But the road remained empty, as it had for 10 years. Whatever that little girl with the blue ribbon had promised, the frontier had likely taught her the same lesson it taught everyone: that promises were luxury items, too expensive for survival. Still, sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, he could hear a child's voice saying, "Wait for me," with such certainty it made him forget, just for a moment, that he'd stopped believing in waiting for anything except the next sunrise, the next season, the next threat to everything he'd built in his careful, solitary way. The summer of 1887 arrived with unusual heat, turning the grasslands brown by July and making the air shimmer like water over the distant buttes. The afternoon stage from Cheyenne rolled into Sagebrush Crossing in a cloud of dust, its iron-reinforced wheels creaking from the journey. Among the passengers stepping down was a young woman in a travel-worn blue dress, her posture straight despite the exhausting ride. Eliza Carver had grown into everything her 8-year-old determination had promised. At 18, she stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the frontier's challenges and emerged stronger. Her hair, still the color of autumn grass, was pinned up properly, though a few strands had escaped during the journey. The childish roundness had given way to defined features, high cheekbones, a firm jaw, and those same bright eyes that missed nothing. She carried a single carpet bag and a small trunk, the sum of her possessions after 10 years of wandering. The Carver family's dreams of prosperity had met the same fate as countless others. Her father had died of pneumonia 5 winters ago, her mother following 2 years later from what the doctor called exhaustion, but Eliza knew was grief. Her brothers had scattered, seeking their fortunes in California goldfields. The town had changed, but Eliza's eyes sought familiar landmarks. Murphy's General Store had expanded, now sporting a painted sign. The saloon had gained a second story. New buildings crowded where empty lots had been, but the cottonwoods by the river remained. And somewhere beyond the town limits stood a ranch she'd carried in her memory like a locket photograph. "Miss, you need help with your trunk." The stage driver, a grizzled man named Hank, looked concerned. Young women traveling alone were rare enough to merit worry. "I can manage, thank you," Eliza replied, her voice carrying a trace of various places, the softness of Missouri, the drawl of Texas, the clip of Colorado. 10 years of movement had layered accents like sediment. Her first stop was Murphy's store. Mrs. Murphy, considerably grayer but still sharp-eyed behind her counter, studied Eliza with the intensity of someone trying to place a face. "I need a room," Eliza said simply, "and information about work." "The hotel's full up with railroad survey crew." "Mrs." Murphy replied. "Mrs. Garrett takes boarders, but she's particular about single women. Might try the boarding house on 2nd Street. Though it's rough, mostly minors and drifters." Before Eliza could respond, Marshal Pike entered, his presence filling the doorway. Years of keeping peace had given him an instinct for potential trouble, and a young woman alone qualified. "Afternoon, Miss Amos Pike, Town Marshal. You arriving or passing through?" "Arriving," Eliza said, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm looking for respectable lodging and work." Pike studied her, the worn but clean dress, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work, the straight-backed posture that suggested pride despite circumstances. "What kind of work?" "Whatever's honest. I can cook, sew, tend sick folks, keep books. I've done it all." "Name?" She hesitated for just a moment. "Eliza Carver." "Mrs." Murphy's intake of breath was audible. "Carver, not little Eliza, who—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "Who kissed Caleb Ward by the river 10 years ago," Eliza finished calmly. "Yes, ma'am. That Eliza—" The silence that followed could have been carved with a knife. Pike's expression shifted from professional concern to something more complex surprise, calculation, and perhaps a touch of respect. "You came back," he said finally. "I said I would." Pike made a decision that would later prove significant. "Miss Carver, the safest place for a respectable woman in your situation would be the Ward Ranch. Caleb needs help with the house been managing alone too long. Board, room, and fair wages. Interested?" "Mrs." Murphy made a small sound of protest. "Marshal Pike, surely that's not people will talk." "People always talk," Pike replied. "But Ward's Ranch is safer than any boarding house, and the man's honor is beyond question. Miss Carver's old enough to make her own choices." Eliza nodded slowly. "I accept. How do I get there?" "I'll drive you myself," Pike said. "Give folks less to gossip about if the marshal provides escort." The 5-mile journey to the Ward Ranch passed in relative silence. Pike drove his buggy with military precision while Eliza took in the landscape familiar yet changed, like a childhood friend met after years apart. The grasslands rolled endlessly, punctuated by the occasional butte or cluster of cottonwoods marking a water source. "He's different than he was," Pike said eventually. "Harder, lonelier, if that's possible. Don't take it personal if he sends you back." "I won't," Eliza replied, though her hands tightened on her carpet bag. The Ward Ranch appeared like a mirage-made solid white clapboard house with a deep porch. barn and outbuildings arranged with practical efficiency, fences straight as rifle shots. Everything spoke of meticulous care and solitary effort. A few horses grazed in the nearest pasture, and in the distance, Eliza could see the dark mass of cattle. Caleb emerged from the barn as they approached, rifle in hand until he recognized Pike's buggy. He moved with the controlled grace of a man always ready for trouble. Setting the weapon aside but within reach, his eyes went from Pike to Eliza, and something flickered across his weathered face, recognition struggling with disbelief. "Caleb," Pike said, climbing down. "Got someone here looking for work. This is Miss Eliza Carver." Caleb stood perfectly still, as if movement might shatter something fragile. Eliza stepped down from the buggy without assistance, smoothing her dress with hands that trembled only slightly. They faced each other across 10 years and 5 feet of dusty yard. "Mr. Ward," she said, her voice steady. "I told you I'd come back." "Miss Carver." His voice was rougher than she remembered, scraped raw by years of brief conversations with horses and cattle. "You were 8 years old, and now I'm 18. I've kept account of every year." Pike cleared his throat. "Miss Carver needs lodging and work. Thought you could use help with the house. She's willing to work for board and wages." Caleb's expression remained unreadable, but Eliza caught the slight tightening around his eyes, a man calculating odds, weighing risks. "This isn't proper. Young woman, unmarried, staying out here?" "When has proper ever mattered in the territories?" Eliza interrupted. "I need work. You need help. I'm not afraid of hard work or hard men. I've survived 10 years of both." "The house has a spare room," Pike added helpfully. "Separate entrance if needed, and with the troubles you've been having, extra eyes watching might not hurt." Caleb looked between them, understanding Pike's implication. A woman's presence might discourage the kind of harassment Boone specialized in or escalate it. But as he studied Eliza, taking in the determined set of her jaw and the steady gaze that reminded him painfully of a little girl making an impossible promise, he found himself nodding. "Room and board, plus $2 a week," he said. "Work starts at dawn. Cooking, cleaning, mending whatever needs doing. You answer to me alone. Anyone bothers you, any trouble at all, you tell me immediate. Understood." "Understood," Eliza agreed. Pike helped unload her trunk, then climbed back onto his buggy. "I'll let folks know Miss Carver's employed proper-like. Should keep the worst of the gossip down." He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Caleb," as the buggy rolled away, leaving them alone. The afternoon sun stretched their shadows long across the yard. Caleb picked up Eliza's trunk as easily as if it were empty and headed for the house. She followed, carpetbag in hand, heart beating steadily but hard. The house was exactly what she'd expected: clean, sparse, functional, everything necessary, nothing superfluous. The kitchen dominated the main floor, with its large stove and long table set for one. The windows were clean but curtainless, letting in sharp rectangles of light. "Your room," Caleb said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a small but pristine space iron bed with a quilted cover, washstand, simple dresser, and a window overlooking the eastern pasture. It smelled of soap and sun-dried linens. "It's perfect," Eliza said softly. Caleb set down her trunk and stepped back, maintaining careful distance. "Supper's at 6. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He paused at the doorway. "Miss Carver, why did you really come back?" Eliza met his gaze directly. "Because I said I would. Because a promise matters. And because—" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "Because even at 8 years old, I could see what kind of man you were. 10 years hasn't changed my mind." Caleb left without responding, but Eliza caught the slight softening around his mouth, not quite a smile, but perhaps the memory of one. She unpacked slowly. hanging her 2 spare dresses in the wardrobe, placing her few treasures on the dresser, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her family before the wandering, and wrapped in soft cloth, a faded blue ribbon she'd saved through every mile and every loss. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the grasslands gold and red, Eliza Carver stood at her new window and allowed herself one moment of pure relief. She was here. She had kept her promise. Whatever came next, gossip, hard work, Caleb's careful distance, she would face it. The frontier had taught her that survival meant adaptation, but it had never managed to kill the flame of certainty that had driven her back to this place, this man, this chance at building something lasting in a landscape that devoured the weak and the wavering alike. The summer church social arrived 3 weeks after Eliza's return to Sagebrush Crossing, the small Methodist church, whitewashed and plain, transformed for the occasion with lanterns strung between posts and tables groaning under the weight of pies, preserves, and covered dishes. The entire town turned out ranchers and merchants, married women and hopeful bachelors, children racing between the adults' legs like scattered chickens. Eliza wore her best dress, a simple green cotton that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes. She'd spent extra time on her hair, pinning it up in a style she'd learned in Denver, though she knew the effort was more for her own confidence than anyone else's approval. Beside her, Caleb stood like a man attending his own execution, uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes and the social scrutiny both. They'd settled into a working rhythm at the ranch. Eliza rose before dawn to start breakfast. Caleb already gone to check the stock. They ate in companionable silence, discussing the day's necessities, fence repairs, supply needs, which pastures to rotate. Evenings found them on the porch, Eliza mending while Caleb cleaned tack or sharpened tools, the sunset painting the grasslands in shades of copper and violet. But here, under the weight of the town's collective gaze, their careful balance felt fragile as spring ice. "The ward hermit brought his child bride," someone whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Shameful," another voice added. "A girl that age." Eliza kept her expression pleasant, though her jaw tightened. She'd known this would come the judgment. The assumptions. 10 years age difference might be nothing in established society, but combined with their strange history and her current position, it provided ample fuel for gossip. The church ladies circled like hawks, questions disguised as concern. "Such a brave girl, keeping house for Mr. Ward." "Mrs." Pritchard simpered. "Though surely a young woman like yourself has other prospects." "I'm exactly where I choose to be," Eliza replied evenly, accepting a glass of lemonade from the minister's wife. Across the yard, Caleb stood with Marshall Pike and a few other ranchers, discussing cattle prices and the persistent drought. But Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept moving toward where his gun belt would normally rest. The moment came during the dancing. The fiddler struck up "Turkey in the Straw," and couples began forming on the makeshift dance floor. Silas Boone, prosperous in a silk vest despite the heat, approached with the confidence of a man who rarely heard no. "Miss Carver," he said, sweeping off his hat in an exaggerated gesture, "would you honor me with a dance?" The question fell into a pocket of silence, conversations pausing as people sensed drama brewing. Boone was everything Caleb wasn't smooth-talking, socially adept, wealthy enough to ignore convention when it suited him. He was also, Eliza had learned from town gossip, the man trying to force Caleb off his land. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, but I'm not dancing this evening," Eliza said politely. Boone's smile sharpened. "Come now. A pretty young thing like you shouldn't waste her youth tending house for a man who barely knows you're alive. Unless—" He let the pause hang meaningfully. "Perhaps those childhood promises mean more than they should." The crowd held its collective breath. Eliza set down her lemonade glass very carefully, then stepped forward into the circle of lantern light. When she spoke, Her voice carried clearly across the yard. Mr. Boone, I made a promise when I was 8 years old because even then I could recognize decency when I saw it. I'm 18 now, and I keep that promise not from childish fancy but from adult choice. I've seen enough of men who talk smooth and grab rough, who measure worth in dollars and view people as property to be acquired. She turned slowly, addressing the entire gathering. Yes, I kissed Caleb Ward by the river 10 years ago. Yes, I told him to wait. And yes, I came back, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because in all my travels, through all the towns and territories, I never found a man who helped his neighbors without seeking credit, who worked his land honest, who kept his word even when it cost him. Her gaze found Caleb across the yard. I'm not a child bride, and I'm not a kept woman. I'm a woman who knows her own mind and made her own choice. If that scandalized you, perhaps you should examine why a woman's agency frightens you more than a man's persistence. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves. Then, from the back of the crowd, "Old Mrs." Henderson began to clap slowly. A few others joined her, not many, but enough. Boone's face had darkened to the color of old brick. Pretty speech, miss, but you might find that choosing sides in range disputes can be unhealthy. Before anyone could respond, Caleb was there, moving through the crowd with the quiet purpose of a man who'd reached his limit. He didn't touch Boone, didn't raise his voice, but something in his presence made the smaller man step back. "And Mr. Boone," Caleb said quietly, "you'll want to remember that Miss Carver is under my protection. Any man who forgets that will answer to me. Any man who threatens her, even with words, will find out why I've survived out here alone for so long." Marshal Pike materialized at Boone's elbow. "Evening's getting on. Silas, might be time you headed home." Boone looked between them, calculating odds. The crowd had shifted subtly, and not in his favor. Eliza's words had reminded them that Caleb Ward had been their neighbor for over a decade, steady and reliable, while Boone was still a newcomer with Eastern money and flexible ethics. "This isn't over," Boone said finally, settling his hat with sharp movements. "No," Caleb agreed. "But it is for tonight." After Boone's departure, the social continued with forced normality. The fiddler resumed playing, couples danced, children were collected as full dark approached. Several women approached Eliza, not many, but a few. "Mrs." Henderson pressed her hand warmly, and the minister's wife offered a quiet word of support. The ride home took place under a canopy of stars so thick they seemed to press down on the prairie. Eliza sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, acutely aware of the space between them and the larger space created by the evening's confrontation. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." Caleb was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "You told the truth. That's nothing to apologize for. People will talk more now." People were always going to talk. At least now they're talking about the right things. They rolled on through the darkness, the horses knowing the way home. An owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, and its mate answered a conversation in the dark that needed no words. "What you said," Caleb began, then stopped, started again. "About recognizing decency. I don't know if I'm what you think you saw." Eliza turned to study his profile in the starlight. "You're exactly what I saw, then and now. The only difference is now I understand how rare it is." Back at the ranch, Caleb tended the horses while Eliza went inside to start coffee. The familiar routine settled around them like well-worn clothes. But something had shifted. The careful distance Caleb had maintained had cracked, just slightly, like the first fissure in ice before spring thaw. As they sat on the porch with their coffee, watching heat lightning play along the horizon, Eliza felt the weight of the choice she'd proclaimed so boldly. She'd drawn lines in public, chosen sides in conflicts that went deeper than one man's greed. But sitting here in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the quiet breathing of the man beside her. She felt no regret. 10 years is a long time to remember a promise, Caleb said suddenly. Not so long, Eliza replied. Not when you're waiting for something worth having. The heat lightning flashed again, illuminating the landscape in brief. Stark relief the endless grass, the distant buttes, the small outpost of civilization they were building together against all odds and opinions. In that moment of brightness, Eliza saw Caleb's hand resting on the porch rail, worn and scarred from honest work. She placed her own hand beside it, not touching but close enough to feel the warmth. They sat that way until the coffee grew cold and the lightning moved on toward the mountains. Two people learning that some promises, no matter how improbable their beginning, carry their own power to reshape the world around them. The days following the church social settled into a new rhythm. Eliza threw herself into learning the particular demands of ranch life, so different from the nomadic existence she'd known. Under Caleb's patient instruction, she learned to read the sky for weather, to spot a sick calf from across a pasture, to mend harnesses with stitches strong enough to hold against a panicked horse. Keep your thumb flat against the leather, Caleb demonstrated one evening, his large hands gentle despite their strength. The needle follows the groove better that way. Eliza mimicked his movements, aware of his presence beside her on the porch bench. The late summer air hung thick with the scent of cured hay and distant rain that might or might not reach them. When her needle slipped, pricking her finger, she bit back a curse she'd learned in a Colorado mining camp. Here, Caleb said, producing a clean handkerchief. Their fingers brushed as he wrapped the small wound, and Eliza felt heat that had nothing to do with the evening warmth. The ranch revealed itself to her in layers. She learned the network of springs and seeps that made the Ward property valuable, understood why certain pastures were saved for drought months, discovered the careful rotation that kept the land healthy. Caleb's relationship with the terrain was intimate as a marriage. He knew every draw and rise, every seasonal change, every place where danger might lurk. My father started here with nothing but a wagon and stubbornness, he told her one morning as they checked the fence line. Proved up the claim by breaking his back and most of his dreams. I was born in that original soddy, down where the old corral stands. What happened to it? Eliza asked, handling her horse with increasing confidence. Burned in a lightning strike when I was 12. We built the house then, Ma insisting on wood frame and real windows. His expression softened with memory. She died the next winter. Pa said she'd held on just long enough to see us in a proper house. They worked through the morning heat, replacing rotted posts and tightening wire. Eliza's hands, already calloused from years of work, developed new patterns of hardness. When they stopped at noon to eat the cold biscuits and bacon she'd packed, she noticed Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? He considered this, chewing slowly. Don't know. Maybe thought you'd come back all cityfied, soft, full of romantic notions about ranch life. Eliza laughed, a sound that startled a meadowlark from a nearby sage bush. 10 years of following my father's dreams cured me of romantic notions. I've mucked stables in Kansas, picked cotton in Texas, nursed sick miners in Colorado. I know what work is. Why come back here, then could have settled anywhere? She met his gaze steadily. Because I made a promise. And because, she paused, choosing honesty over caution. Because even as a child, I recognized something in you, a solidness, like these fence posts, deep-rooted, dependable, built to last. A dust devil swirled across the pasture, and Caleb watched it dissolve before responding. Posts can weather check, get brittle, break under too much strain. Not if they're maintained properly, Eliza countered. Not if someone cares enough to tend them. The conversation hung between them as they returned to work, but Eliza caught Caleb glancing at her throughout the afternoon with something like wonder. That evening brought the test of a different kind. A summer storm built in the west, towers of clouds piling up like dark castles against the sky. The air turned electric, making the horses restless and setting the cattle to milling. "Could be a bad one," Caleb said, securing shutters. "Maybe hail." They worked together, preparing moving the remuda to the sheltered corral, checking that nothing loose could become a projectile, filling extra water barrels in case the pump was damaged. The efficiency of their partnership struck Eliza as they anticipated each other's needs without words. The storm hit just after dark with a violence that made Eliza understand why settlers spoke of weather as an enemy. Wind screamed around the house corners, and hail hammered the roof like artillery fire. Lightning turned the world white-blue-white in staccato bursts. They sat in the kitchen, lantern light wavering with each gust that found its way through the walls. Caleb had brought his rifle inside, though what good it would do against nature's fury was questionable. "First storm?" he asked, noticing her tension. "First one in a real house in years," she admitted. "Canvas and weather don't mix well." As if to emphasize her point, something crashed outside a piece of roofing, perhaps, or a tree branch. Caleb started to rise, but Eliza caught his arm. "You can't fight wind," she said. "Learned that in Kansas." He settled back, and she realized she was still holding his arm. The sleeve of his work shirt was soft with washing, the muscle beneath solid as stone. She should let go. She didn't. "Tell me about Kansas," he said quietly. So she did, her voice weaving through the storm's chaos. She told him about grasshopper plagues that darkened the sky, about helping deliver babies in sod houses, about the winter they ate nothing but cornmeal and prairie turnips for 2 months. She talked until the storm's fury began to ease, until rain replaced hail and wind dropped to manageable levels. "You've lived more in 18 years than most do in 50, Caleb observed. "Living and surviving aren't the same thing," Eliza replied. "I survived out there. Here." She paused, searching for words. "Here feels like I could actually live." The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and sharp with ozone. They ventured out to assess damage-lost shingles, a section of corral fence down, minor casualties in a land that demanded major resilience. As they stood in the yard, watching stars emerge between racing clouds, Eliza felt the solid presence of the house behind them, the spread of land around them, the potential for permanence she'd never dared imagine. Days later, at the general store for supplies, Eliza overheard Mrs. Murphy talking with another woman. "That Carver girl's tougher than she looks. Heard she and Ward worked straight through that storm. Had the fence fixed before noon next day." "Still irregular," the other woman sniffed. "A young woman alone with a bachelor." "Nothing irregular about hard work, Mrs. Murphy retorted. "And Caleb Ward's been alone too long. Man needs help, and she's providing it. Christian charity, if you ask me." Eliza hid her smile as she collected her purchases. The town's opinion was shifting, slowly, like a creek changing course. It would never be full acceptance. The West had its own strict codes despite its freedoms, but it was enough. That evening, as she served supper, beef stew rich with garden vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, Caleb cleared his throat awkwardly. "Been thinking," he said. "You ought to learn to shoot. Properly, I mean, not just scattergun pointing." Eliza looked up sharply. "Because of Boone." "Because this is the territory. Everyone should know how to defend themselves." He paused. "But yes, partly because of Boone." After dishes, he set up targets against the hillside tin cans at various distances. The rifle he handed her was well maintained, but not new, its stock worn smooth by use. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "Winchester 73. She could shoot the eye out of a crow at 100 yards. The weight of trust in that gesture wasn't lost on Eliza. She held the rifle carefully, following his instructions on stance and breathing. Caleb stood behind her, adjusting her position, and she was acutely aware of every point of near contact. "Steady," he murmured near her ear. "Let the shot surprise you." The rifle cracked, and a can spun off its perch. Eliza felt a fierce joy at the accomplishment, turning to find Caleb smiling a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "Natural talent," he said, "must run in determined women." They practiced until dusk made shooting impossible, and Eliza's shoulder ached from the rifle's kick. As they walked back to the house, Caleb carrying the rifle, Eliza felt the day's significance like a weight. She'd been handed more than a weapon. She'd been given trust, protection, a place in the defense of this small kingdom they were building against all odds. "Thank you," she said simply. Caleb nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaboration. Inside, as Eliza rubbed liniment on her bruised shoulder, she thought about the nature of promises, how they could grow and change, deepen like rivers cutting through stone. What had begun as a child's impulsive gesture had evolved into something adult and complex, grounded not in fairy tale notions, but in shared work, mutual respect, and the slow-building foundation of genuine partnership. Outside, coyotes called across the darkness, their voices wild and free. But inside the lamp-lit kitchen, civilization held it small. Vital ground, two people learning that the strongest walls weren't built of wood or stone, but of moments like these, accumulated day by day, season by season, until they became unshakable as the mountains themselves. The trouble with Silas Boone escalated as autumn approached. His tactics shifted from subtle harassment to open aggression, cut fence lines, diverted water, mysterious stampedes in the night. Each incident fell just short of proof needed for legal action, leaving Caleb and Eliza to manage the consequences while maintaining their daily survival. One September morning, Eliza woke to the acrid smell of smoke. She flew from bed, not bothering with a wrapper over her nightgown, to find the sky glowing orange to the west. The hay barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the season's feed supply. Caleb was already organizing the fight, his two hired hands, Tom Garrett, barely 16, and old Miguel working the pump while he beat at the edges with wet blankets. Eliza grabbed a bucket and joined the line, her bare feet burning on the hot ground. They fought with the desperation of people who understood that losing the hay meant losing cattle come winter. Water sloshed and steam hissed. Smoke burned their lungs and stung their eyes. Eliza's nightgown was soaked through, clinging and hampering her movements, but modesty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Young Tom collapsed from smoke inhalation just as they brought the fire under control. Eliza dropped her bucket and ran to him, pulling him clear of the smoke. His face was gray, lips tinged blue. Without thinking, she tilted his head back and breathed into his lungs the way she'd seen a doctor do once in Denver. "Come on, boy," she urged between breaths. "Don't you dare die on my watch." Tom coughed, sputtered, and drew a ragged breath on his own. Eliza sagged with relief, only then noticing Caleb watching her with an expression of fierce pride mixed with something deeper. Dawn revealed the damage, half the barn gone, most of the hay destroyed. But they'd saved the structure and some feed. More importantly, they'd saved Tom. As Eliza tended the boy's burns with salve and clean bandages, she noticed the hoof prints leading away from the barn, heading toward Boone's property. "We need the marshal," she said quietly. Caleb shook his head. "Need evidence first. Tracks aren't enough, could claim his horses got loose." "Then we get evidence," Eliza said, steel in her voice. Marshal Pike arrived by noon, his practiced eye taking in the scene. He examined the tracks, the burn pattern, the conveniently cut fence that would have allowed easy access. "Suspicious," he allowed. "But suspicion isn't proof. You know that, Caleb." "I know it," Caleb agreed grimly. "Also know this won't stop until someone stops it." Pike's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Don't take the law into your own hands. That's what Boone wants, an excuse to have you arrested or shot in self-defense. File a complaint, document everything, build a case proper-like." After Pike left, Eliza found Caleb standing amid the ruined hay, fists clenched. She'd changed into work clothes and pinned up her smoke-singed hair, but the memory of the night's terror still clung like ash. "We can buy hay from the Hendersons," she said practically. "It'll be expensive, but—" "It's not about the hay," Caleb interrupted. "It's about him thinking he can drive us out. About him being right that there's nothing I can do to stop him." The us in that statement made Eliza's heart skip, but she focused on the immediate problem. "Then we don't let him be right. We document. We endure. We outlast him." "You could have been killed," Caleb said suddenly, turning to face her. "If the fire had spread to the house." But it didn't. This time, his voice was raw. "Eliza, I've been alone so long I forgot what it means to have someone else at risk. Maybe you should—" "Don't!" She stepped closer, close enough to see the smoke damage on his shirt, the singed edges of his hair. "Don't you dare tell me to leave for my own good. I chose this. I choose it every morning when I wake up and every night when I go to bed. You don't get to take that choice away because you're scared." "I am scared," he admitted, the words seeming to surprise him. "Scared of losing something I'm only just starting to believe I could have." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Eliza raised her hand slowly, giving him time to step back, and touched his face. His skin was rough with stubble and smoke residue, warm under her palm. "Then we'd better make sure we don't lose it," she said simply. The next weeks brought a strange sort of siege. Boone's harassment continued. Dead cattle left where they'd find them, tools disappearing, waterholes fouled. But the community began to notice. Other ranchers reported similar troubles. The minister preached about neighbors standing together. Misses. Murphy pointedly refused Boone's business when he tried to order supplies. Eliza started keeping detailed records, her neat handwriting documenting every incident with dates, times, and witness names. She also began accompanying the hired hands on their rounds, rifle across her saddle, presence a deterrent to the more cowardly of Boone's men. One evening, as she helped Tom practice his letters, the boy's education having been interrupted by the need to work, they were interrupted by hoofbeats. Two riders approached through the dusk strangers, hard-faced men with the look of hired trouble. "Evening, miss," one said, not bothering to dismount. "We're looking for Ward." "He's not here," Eliza lied smoothly. Caleb was in the barn, but instinct warned her not to reveal that. "Expected back tomorrow." The man smiled unpleasantly. "Shame. Had a message for him. Maybe you could pass it along." "I'm listening." "Mr. Boone's a generous man, offering twice what this spread's worth. Cash money. Enough for Ward to start over somewhere else. Somewhere healthier." Eliza stood slowly, aware of Tom tensing beside her. "And if Mr. Ward isn't interested in selling—" "Well now, that'd be unfortunate." "Man alone, sorry. Mostly alone, lot of accidents can happen." "Why?" "Just last week a rancher up in Johnson County fell off his horse, broke his neck. Tragic." The threat was clear as water. "I'll pass along the message," Eliza said evenly. "Now get off our land." The man's expression darkened. "Listen here, girlie." The distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut him off. Caleb stepped from the barn's shadow, Winchester aimed steady. "The lady asked you to leave." The riders exchanged glances, calculating odds, 2 against 1, but Caleb had cover in clear sight. Plus, Tom had produced a shotgun from somewhere, and even Eliza had her hand on the pistol at her hip. "No need for unpleasantness," the spokesman said, backing his horse. "We delivered our message." They rode off slowly, making a point of their lack of fear, but they rode off. "Pack a bag," Caleb said as soon as they were gone. "I'm taking you to town tomorrow." "No." "Eliza." "No." She faced him squarely. "We've had this conversation. I'm not leaving." "They threatened you, clear as—" "They threatened us," she corrected. "And running won't stop them. It'll just teach them that threats work." Tom cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll just check the stock. He fled, leaving them alone in the gathering darkness. Caleb set down his rifle and crossed to her in 2 strides. You don't understand. If something happened to you, then don't let it happen, Eliza interrupted. Fight with me, not against me. Trust me to stand beside you instead of trying to protect me by pushing me away. He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her against him roughly. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was desperation and fear and fierce protectiveness all tangled together. Eliza held on just as tightly, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her cheek. I'm not good at this, he said into her hair, at having someone to lose. Then we'd better get good at it together, she replied, because I'm not going anywhere. They stood that way until full dark, holding each other in the yard where anyone could see, past caring about propriety. The threats had stripped away pretense, leaving only the essential truth they were in this together, for better or worse, against whatever came. Later, as they planned their next moves, legal documents to file, allies to contact, defenses to strengthen. Eliza felt a shift in the air between them. The careful distance Caleb had maintained was gone, replaced by something fiercer and more honest. They were partners now in every sense, united against forces that sought to tear apart what they were building. When this is over, Caleb said suddenly, looking up from the map they were studying. When Boone's dealt with and things are settled. Yes, Eliza prompted when he trailed off. He met her eyes directly. I want to do this proper, court you like you deserve. Not in the middle of threats and fires, but real and right. Eliza smiled, the expression lighting her smoke-smudged face. Caleb Ward, are you saying you want to come calling? I'm saying I want to make things official, legal, permanent. He paused. If you'll have me. I traveled 10 years and 1,000 miles to have you. She reminded him. A little thing like a range war isn't going to change my mind. Outside, coyotes howled their ancient songs, and the wind carried the scent of smoke and sage. But inside the kitchen, 2 people bent over their plans with renewed determination, knowing that whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else together, stubborn as the land itself, and twice as enduring. The journey to Laramie took 2 days by wagon, dust rising like smoke signals with every turn of the wheels. Eliza had never seen Caleb in a proper suit before black broadcloth that emphasized his shoulders. String tie knotted carefully at his throat. She wore her best dress, pressed with meticulous care, her documentation case clutched in her lap like armor. The courthouse stood 3 stories tall, an imposing brick edifice that represented civilization's attempt to impose order on the territories. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and muted conversations, the smell of ink and old paper heavy in the air. Their lawyer, Mr. James Morrison, had come recommended by Marshall Pike, a young man from Nebraska, with idealistic fire in his eyes and a reputation for taking cases others wouldn't touch. Your documentation is thorough, Morrison said, reviewing Eliza's careful records. Miss Carver has done excellent work here, but Boone has hired Harrison and Associates. They're well-connected. Meaning bought, Caleb said flatly. Meaning we need to be perfect, Morrison corrected. Every detail, every word, they'll try to paint you as a troublemaker. Mr. Ward, a man who refuses to be reasonable. And Miss Carver. He hesitated. They'll try to discredit me as a woman of loose morals. Eliza finished calmly. Living unmarried with a bachelor, pursuing a childhood fantasy, I'm prepared for that. The hearing was set for the following morning. That evening, in the small hotel room she'd taken propriety, mattering more now than ever. Eliza sat brushing her hair and trying to calm her nerves. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It's me, Caleb's voice came through the door. She let him in, noting how he filled the small space. You shouldn't be here. If someone sees... I don't care. He stood awkwardly. hat in hand. I wanted to say something, in case tomorrow goes badly. It won't. But if it does, he met her eyes. I want you to know that these past months having you at the ranch, working beside you, it's been like coming alive after a long sleep. Whatever happens tomorrow, that's been real. That's been worth everything. Eliza set down her brush and crossed to him. Nothing's ending tomorrow. Caleb, we're going to win, and then we're going home. Home, he repeated, wonder in his voice. Never felt like that before you came. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Word had spread the hermit rancher and his young housekeeper against the influential Silas Boone. It was the kind of drama that drew crowds in a territory hungry for entertainment. Judge Theodore Blackwood presided, a stern man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Eliza was called first to testify, walking to the witness chair with her head high despite the whispers that followed her. Morrison led her through the events methodically, the cut fences, the poisoned water holes, the burned barn. Eliza spoke clearly, referring to her notes for exact dates and times. She described finding Tom unconscious, the hoofprints leading toward Boone's property, the threats made by hired men. Then came Harrison's cross-examination. The lawyer was smooth as oil, his questions designed to undermine rather than illuminate. Miss Carver, you're not married to Mr. Ward? No, sir. Yet you live in his house, alone with him. I work for Mr. Ward as housekeeper and assist with ranch duties. I have my own room and maintain proper boundaries. How old were you when you first met Mr. Ward? 8 years old. And you claim you made him a promise then to return? Yes. Harrison's smile was predatory. Tell me, Miss Carver, don't you think it's rather unusual for a grown man to wait for a child's promise, some might say inappropriate? Eliza's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. What's inappropriate, Mr. Harrison, is twisting an innocent childhood moment into something unseemly. I made a promise because I recognized kindness. I kept it because I grew up to value honor. If you find that unusual, perhaps that says more about you than us. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Blackwood rapped his gavel for silence. Caleb testified next, his discomfort with public speaking evident, but his words carrying weight. He detailed each incident, focusing on facts rather than emotions. When asked why he wouldn't sell to Boone, his answer was simple. My father broke that land. My mother's buried there. It's not for sale at any price. The most dramatic moment came when Morrison called Tom Garrett. The boy, pale but determined, described the night of the fire. I saw riders, he said. 3 of them. Recognized one Jake Colton. He works for Mr. Boone. Saw him clear in the firelight. Harrison objected furiously. But the damage was done. Jake Colton was sitting in the courtroom, and his sudden pallor was more eloquent than any testimony. Marshal Pike took the stand last, bringing with him a piece of evidence that Morrison had kept secret. Found this near the Ward property line, he said, producing a horseshoe. Custom-made, distinctive mark, matches the shoes on Mr. Boone's personal riding horse. The courtroom erupted. Boone shot to his feet, face purple with rage. This is a setup. They're trying to... You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Boone, Judge Blackwood said coldly. Sit down or be removed. The afternoon brought Boone's defense denials, alternative explanations, character witnesses who owed him money. But the seed of doubt had been planted. When Boone himself took the stand, his polished demeanor cracked under Morrison's questioning. You've made offers for the Ward Ranch. Business propositions. Nothing wrong with that. How many times? Several. And when Mr. Ward refused, I respected his decision. Did you? Then how do you explain your horse's shoe print near his burned barn? Horses wander. Could have been there any time. At the exact location where riders were seen the night of the fire. Boone's composure finally snapped. That land should be developed wards sitting on resources that could benefit the entire county. He's selfish, backward. So you decided to force him out? I decided to make him see reason. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison looked like he'd swallowed broken glass. Judge Blackwood's expression could have frozen hell. The judge's decision came after an hour's recess. While this court cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Boone personally set the fire, the evidence strongly suggests harassment and intimidation. Mr. Boone, you are fined $500 for disturbing the peace and ordered to cease all contact with the Ward Ranch. Any further incidents will result in criminal charges. It wasn't complete victory. Boone avoided jail, but it was enough. As they filed out, Eliza heard the shift in public opinion. Murmurs of, "About time someone stood up to him," and "That girl's got spine," followed them to the street. Outside, in the harsh afternoon sun, Morrison shook their hands. "You did well, both of you. Boone won't dare move against you now, too many eyes watching." That evening, they started for home, camping under stars that seemed especially bright, around their small fire, with coffee boiling and bacon frying. Eliza felt the tension of weeks finally easing. "You were magnificent," Caleb said suddenly. "In court, the way you stood up to that lawyer." "I was terrified," she admitted, "but anger is stronger than fear." "That why you came back, anger?" She looked at him across the fire, this man who'd waited without knowing he was waiting, who'd built a life solid as bedrock and just as lonely. "No, I came back for the same reason I spoke up in court, because some things are worth fighting for." They reached home the next afternoon to find Tom and Miguel had kept everything running smooth. The horses nickered welcome, the cattle grazed peacefully, and the house stood solid against the endless sky. As Eliza climbed down from the wagon, she noticed something different. A new fence section, painted white, with a gate. "Tom's idea," Miguel explained. Grinning, said the place needed a proper entrance for a proper family. Family. The word hung in the air like a blessing. Caleb cleared his throat roughly. "Good work, both of you. There'll be extra in your pay this month." That night, as Eliza updated her records with the court's decision, she felt Caleb watching from the doorway. "Legal troubles are done," he said. "Boone won't risk more now." "No," she agreed. "That battle's won." "So I was thinking." He entered the room properly, standing before her desk. "About what I said before, about doing things proper." Eliza set down her pen, heart suddenly racing. "Yes. Would you take a ride with me Sunday after church like proper courting?" She smiled, joy bubbling up like spring water. "Mr. Ward, are you asking to court me officially?" "I'm asking to court you with the intention of marriage," he said formally. "If you're willing." "I traveled 1,000 miles and fought a range war for you," she reminded him. "I think I'm willing." He smiled then, that rare expression that transformed his weathered features. Outside, the wind sang through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to the rising moon. But inside the house that was finally becoming a home, two people began planning a future built on promises kept, battles won, and the kind of love that could survive anything the frontier threw at them. The verdict from Laramie rippled through the county like a stone dropped in still water. Silas Boone paid his fine through gritted teeth. His influence diminished, but his rage intact. For a week, an uneasy peace settled over the territory, the kind of quiet that made old-timers check their weapons and scan the horizon more carefully than usual. The change in Sagebrush Crossing was palpable. Where before there had been whispers and sideways glances, now Eliza received nods of respect, misses. Murphy set aside the best cuts of fabric when new shipments arrived. The minister's wife invited her to join the church auxiliary. Even the saloon girls, normally kept at careful distance from respectable women, offered small smiles when paths crossed. "You stood up to him, Mrs." Henderson explained over tea one afternoon. Not many would dare. Boone's had this town under his thumb since he arrived. Seeing him taking down a peg gives folks hope. The courtship between Caleb and Eliza became public knowledge, conducted with all the propriety they'd previously ignored. Sunday rides along the river, carefully chaperoned visits to town social events, evening walks where they maintained a respectable distance. It might have been comical, this formal dance, after months of working side by side, except for the way they looked at each other, like travelers who'd finally found their way home. The wedding was set for late September, when the worst of the summer heat had passed, but before winter locked down the territory. Eliza threw herself into preparations with the same methodical efficiency she brought to ranch work. The house needed proper curtains. The garden expansion she'd planned required planting, and her wedding dress, sewn by her own hands, demanded attention to every detail. It was during one of these preparation days that young Tom burst through the kitchen door, face flushed with exertion and fear. "Riders coming!" he gasped. 6 of them, armed!" Eliza grabbed the rifle Caleb had taught her to use, checking the load automatically. "Where's Caleb?" "North pasture with Miguel. I lit out soon as I saw them." Through the window, Eliza could see the dust cloud approaching. Not Boone himself, he was too clever for that, but hired guns with hard faces and harder intentions. The leader, a man with dead eyes and a scar bisecting his left cheek, dismounted just outside the gate Tom and Miguel had built. "Afternoon, miss," he called, looking for Ward. "He's not here," Eliza replied through the barely opened door. "State your business." "Private matter. We'll wait." "You'll wait off our property," Eliza countered, making sure they could see the rifle barrel. The scarred man smiled unpleasantly. "Now that's unfriendly, mister. Boone just wants to make one final offer. Generous one. Would be a shame if Ward didn't hear it." "Mister, Boone's had his answer multiple times. In court, even." "Court's one thing," another rider said. "Reality's another. Man can't watch every fence line, every water hole, every head of cattle. Accidents happen, diseases spread, markets shift. Smart man knows when to cut his losses." The threat was clear, but before Eliza could respond, she heard hoofbeats Caleb and Miguel riding hard from the north. They'd seen the dust, read the danger. Caleb dismounted in a smooth motion, rifle already in hand, while Miguel flanked wide, creating a crossfire position. "Gentlemen," Caleb said, voice deadly quiet. "You're trespassing." "Just delivering a message," Scarface replied. "Mister, Boone's willing to go to 3,000. Cash money, more than this dirt's worth. My land's not for sale. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow." "That's unfortunate." Scarface shifted slightly, hand moving toward his pistol. "Mister, Boone doesn't like being disappointed." What happened next occurred with the speed of lightning. Scarface drew, or started to. Caleb's rifle spoke first, the shot taking the man's hat off and leaving a graze along his scalp. The other riders reached for weapons but froze as Miguel's shotgun swung to cover them, and Eliza's rifle barrel appeared fully through the door. "Next one won't be a warning," Caleb said conversationally. "You boys want to ride out vertical or horizontal." Blood trickled down Scarface's cheek, matching his scar. His eyes held murder, but also calculation. 6 guns against 3, but the defenders had cover and the moral high ground. More importantly, killing Caleb Ward after the public trial would bring real law, maybe even federal marshals. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes," Caleb replied. "It is. You tell Boone he moves against me or mine again. I'll kill him. Not his property, not his men. Him, personal." "That's not a threat, it's a promise." "And folks around here know I keep those." The riders left slowly, pride demanding they not appear to flee. As dust settled in their wake, Eliza emerged from the house, rifle still ready. Caleb looked at her hair escaping its pins, dress covered by an old apron. Face set with determination, and something fierce and proud crossed his features. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine, though I'm thinking we might want to move the wedding up." That night, they held a war council. Tom, Miguel, even Mrs. Henderson and Marshall Pike gathered in the kitchen. The consensus was clear: Boone wouldn't accept defeat. He'd probe for weakness, wait for opportunity, strike when defenses dropped. Could post guards. Pike suggested. "I could deputize some men?" "For how long?" Caleb asked. "Can't live under siege forever." "Then we end it," Eliza said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Boone's strength is his money, his connections. But he's got weaknesses too. Men like him always do. "What are you thinking?" Pike asked. "I'm thinking about those ledgers Tom saw when he delivered supplies to the Boone spread. About how interesting the territorial tax assessor might find them. About how the railroad investigators have been asking questions about land acquisition practices." A slow smile spread across Pike's face. "That's devious. Miss Carver." "That's survival. Marshall." The plan took shape over coffee and strategy. Legal pressure combined with social isolation. Documentation of Boone's questionable practices sent to appropriate authorities. Legitimate business concerns encouraged to reconsider their associations. Fight fire with paper. Bullets with bureaucracy. 2 weeks later, as Eliza put finishing touches on her wedding dress, word came that Boone was selling out. Federal investigators had arrived, asking uncomfortable questions about forged documents and intimidated sellers. His political friends had melted away like snow in spring. The house of cards he'd built on threats and graft had collapsed. "He's heading to California," Pike reported. "Says the climate here doesn't agree with him." The wedding day dawned crisp and clear. Autumn painting the cottonwoods gold along the river. The little church was packed, the whole town turning out to witness the culmination of a story they'd been watching unfold for months. Eliza wore her mother's pearl brooch on the dress she'd sewn, carried wildflowers picked from the prairie, and walked down the aisle on Marshall Pike's arm with her head high. Caleb waited at the altar, transformed in his black suit but still solid as the mountains. Still the same steady presence she'd recognized as a child. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the silence was profound, a community's endorsement of something that had been earned through trial and triumph. "I do," Eliza said when prompted, voice clear and certain. "I do," Caleb echoed, and if his voice caught slightly, only those closest heard it. They exchanged simple gold bands that caught the light streaming through windows and sealed their union with a kiss that was brief, proper, and somehow contained 10 years of waiting. The celebration afterward spilled out of the church hall into the street. Tables groaned under donated dishes. Fiddle music filled the air, and even the saloon contributed barrels of beer for the men. Eliza danced with seemingly everyone, Tom blushing furiously, Miguel with surprising grace, Pike with military precision. But the moment that mattered came late in the evening, when Caleb led her onto the floor for a slow waltz. They moved together naturally, all the formality of recent weeks falling away, leaving just the two of them turning slowly while their community watched and approved. "No regrets," Caleb murmured. "Only that it took so long," Eliza replied, as they rode home in the decorated wagon, tin cans rattling behind and stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Eliza thought about the journey that had brought them here, a child's impulsive promise, a decade of wandering, months of struggle against those who would destroy what they built, all leading to this moment, this beginning. The house welcomed them with lamplight Tom had left burning. Their house now, truly and legally. As Caleb lifted her over the threshold, tradition even in the territories, Eliza laughed with pure joy. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ward," Caleb said softly. "I've been home since the day I arrived," she corrected. "This just makes it official." Outside, the vast Wyoming night stretched endlessly, full of challenges yet to face. But inside, two people who had fought for their right to happiness finally claimed it. building their life together on foundations as solid as the promises that had brought them together and the love that would keep them strong through whatever storms might come. The drought began in spring. Subtle at first, a few weeks without rain that stretched into a month, then 2. By July, the grass crunched underfoot like broken glass, and the usually reliable streams ran low and sluggish. Caleb watched the sky with increasing concern, reading the high, thin clouds that promised nothing but more heat. "Never seen it this dry," old Miguel said, standing beside the well they'd had to dig deeper. "Not since '71, and that year we lost half the county's cattle." Eliza emerged from the root cellar, wiping sweat from her brow. 6 months married. She'd settled into ranch life with the same determination that had brought her back to Wyoming, but this was different from fighting men like Boone. You couldn't shoot a drought or take it to court. "How's our water holding?" she asked. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks if we're careful," Caleb replied. After that, he didn't need to finish. Without water, the ranch would die. They implemented strict rationing. Every drop was measured, reused when possible. The vegetable garden Eliza had lovingly tended withered to nothing despite her efforts to save it with dishwater and washwater. The cattle grew gaunt, ribs showing through their hides as they searched for grass that wasn't there. It was during this struggle that Eliza first felt the quickening in her womb, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her grab the fence post for support. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't wanted to add to Caleb's worries. Now, with the life stirring inside her, even as life drained from the land around them, she couldn't keep the secret any longer. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching another cloudless sunset, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Caleb," she said quietly, "we're going to have a child." His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, before settling on something fierce and protective. "When?" "Winter, I think December or January." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Of all the times, Eliza, if the drought doesn't break." "Then we'll face it," she interrupted. "Like we've faced everything else, together." The news gave them renewed purpose. A child meant future, meant hope, meant another reason to fight for every drop of water and blade of grass. But it also meant another life depending on their ability to survive. By August, the situation was desperate. Cattle began dying, first the weak ones, then others. The stench of death hung over the prairie. Caleb and Tom worked dawn to dusk, trying to save what they could, while Eliza managed the house with increasingly scarce resources. Then came the day she miscarried. It started with cramps, sharp and wrong. By the time Caleb found her collapsed by the washtub, blood staining her skirts, it was too late. The baby too small to live, too formed to forget, was gone. Dr. Patterson from town did what he could, which wasn't much. "These things happen," he said quietly, "especially in times of hardship. The body knows when conditions aren't right." Eliza lay in bed for 3 days, not from physical weakness, but from a grief that seemed to hollow her out like wind-carving stone. Caleb tended her with clumsy gentleness, bringing water they couldn't spare, food she couldn't eat, sitting beside her through the long, silent nights. "I'm sorry," she whispered on the 3rd night. "I should have been stronger." "Don't," Caleb said roughly. "Don't you dare blame yourself. This drought, this land, it takes what it wants, but it won't take you. I won't let it." She turned to look at him in the lamplight, seeing new lines carved by worry and loss. "I wanted to give you a family, a house with laughter." "You gave me yourself," he replied. "That's family enough. And we'll try again, when times are better, when the rains come back." The next morning, Eliza rose, dressed, and returned to work. There would be time for grief later. Now, there was survival to manage. Help came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Henderson, herself a survivor of child loss, arrived with preserves and quiet understanding. The minister's wife organized the churchwomen to share what little they had. Even the saloon girls sent food with no names attached, understanding loss in their own way. When a drift herd passed through, desperate for water, Caleb made a decision that would have consequences. He opened his wells to them, sharing precious water for a promise of payment when the cattle sold. The trail boss, a weathered man named Jake Sullivan, shook on it with tears in his eyes. "Won't forget this, Ward. When these beeves sell in Kansas, you'll get your share. My word on it." September brought clouds that built and dissipated without releasing rain. Eliza and Caleb worked side by side, hauling water from deeper and deeper wells, watching their cattle shrink to walking bones. Tom had gone to work for a ranch further north where conditions were marginally better, sending half his wages back. Then came the fever outbreak in town. It started in the poorer section, where overcrowding and bad water created perfect conditions for disease. Dr. Patterson was overwhelmed. When Marshal Pike rode out asking for help, Eliza didn't hesitate. "You're still recovering," Caleb protested. "I'm recovered enough," she countered. "And I know nursing. They need help." For 2 weeks, she worked in town, nursing the sick, comforting the dying, helping Doc Patterson mix medicines and change beddings. The saloon was converted to a temporary hospital. Former enemies worked side by side, even some of Boone's former associates pitched in, unified by crisis. A young prostitute named Mary, barely 17, died in Eliza's arms, whispering about a sister in Ohio who didn't know where she was. Eliza wrote the letter herself, a careful fiction about Mary working as a seamstress, saving money to come home. When the fever finally broke, claiming 12 lives but sparing dozens more, the town's perception of Eliza had transformed completely. She wasn't the girl who'd kept a childhood promise anymore. She was the woman who'd risked her own health to save their children. October arrived with the first break in the drought. Not true rain, just a few scattered showers, but enough to settle the dust and bring a flush of green to the hardiest plants. Caleb found Eliza standing in the yard, face turned up to catch the drops. "It's not enough," she said. "Not nearly enough to save us." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But it's hope." The next day brought a letter from Kansas. Jake Sullivan had sold the herd for good prices and was sending Caleb's share enough to buy feed and supplies to last until spring. His note was simple: debts paid are the only kind worth having. As November approached, bringing cooler air and the possibility of snow to replenish the groundwater, Eliza and Caleb took stock of their losses. Half the cattle gone, the garden dead, their savings depleted, and the child who would never draw breath. But as they sat at the kitchen table, planning for winter and beyond, Eliza felt something she hadn't expected, not just survival, but strength. They had endured the worst the land could throw at them. They had faced loss that went bone deep and found they could still stand. "Spring will be better," Caleb said, studying seed catalogs as if they were battle plans. "Yes," Eliza agreed. Then, more quietly, "And we'll try again. For a family." He looked up, concern creasing his features. "Are you sure after what happened?" "After what happened? I know we can survive anything." She interrupted. "This land tried to break us. It failed. We're still here, still together. That baby..." Her voice caught, then steadied. "That baby was wanted and loved, even if only briefly. The next one will be too." That night, the first snow of the season began to fall fat, lazy flakes that promised moisture for the earth and rest for its inhabitants. Eliza and Caleb stood on the porch, watching the land transform under its white blanket. "I used to think strength meant standing alone," Caleb said suddenly. "Like those buttes out there, isolated and enduring. But it's not. Is it? Real strength is standing together, even when everything's trying to tear you apart." Eliza leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid presence of him against the cold night. "Especially then," she agreed. The drought would be recorded in history books as one of the worst in Wyoming territory. But for those who lived through it, the real story wasn't in statistics of cattle lost or wells run dry. It was in the small acts of courage, the shared griefs and smaller joys, the bonds forged in hardship that proved stronger than prosperity could ever create. And in a small ranch house where lamplight pushed back the darkness, two people planned for spring with the unshakable faith of those who had faced the worst and chosen to hope for better. Years flowed like the Platte River itself, sometimes rushing with spring melt, sometimes barely trickling through drought seasons, but always moving forward. The railroad's whistle had become as familiar as coyote songs, and Sagebrush Crossing boasted a proper schoolhouse, 2 churches, and even a small library that Eliza had helped establish. The Ward Ranch had evolved too. What started as one man's lonely outpost had become a thriving operation. The original house had gained additions: a larger kitchen, a proper parlor, and bedrooms that no longer stood empty. The most important addition played in the yard now, his bare feet kicking up dust as he chased chickens. Jonah Ward, 5 years old, had arrived not as Eliza and Caleb's blood child, but as another of the frontier's orphans. His mother, a young woman abandoned by a traveling man, had died of childbed fever despite Eliza and Doc Patterson's best efforts. With her last breath, she'd pressed her baby into Eliza's arms with no words needed. "He's ours now," Eliza had said simply when she brought the infant home, and Caleb had nodded, understanding that families in the West were made by choice as much as by blood. Now, watching Jonah attempt to corner a particularly cunning hen, Eliza felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Not grief for the children she'd lost 2 more miscarriages after the drought year, but gratitude for the one who'd found his way to them. "Ma pa says I can ride with him to check the north pasture," Jonah announced, abandoning his chicken hunt. "Only if you wear your hat," Eliza called back. "Sun's fierce today." Caleb emerged from the barn, older now, gray threading through his hair like silver veins in rock, but still moving with the contained power she'd recognized 20 years ago. He swung Jonah up onto his shoulders easily, the boy's delighted shriek scaring the chickens into the coop. "We'll be back by supper," Caleb said, catching Eliza's eye with a private smile that still made her heart skip. As they rode out, Eliza returned to her task preparing for the visitors arriving on the afternoon stage. Her brothers, James Jr. and Tommy, had written months ago about coming to see the sister they'd barely kept in touch with during their gold-seeking years. Success had finally found them in California, and with it, a desire to reconnect with family. The reunion was awkward at first. 20 years had transformed them, all the boys, into men with city polish and soft hands. Eliza into something harder and truer than they'd expected. They sat on the porch, these strangers bound by blood, trying to bridge decades with careful words. "You've done well," James Jr. said, surveying the ranch. "Better than we expected when you wrote about marrying a cowboy." "Caleb's more than a cowboy," Eliza replied evenly. "He's a rancher, a businessman, a father, and the best man I've ever known." Tommy, always the more perceptive, watched Jonah playing with the dog. "Your letter said you couldn't have children." "Couldn't carry them," Eliza corrected. "But the West has plenty of children who need parents. Jonah's ours in every way that matters." When Caleb returned with Jonah, the boy dusty and chattering about the hawk they'd seen, her brothers witnessed the easy affection between father and son. The way Jonah ran to Eliza with his treasures, a pretty rock, a hawk feather, stories tumbling over each other. At dinner, the divide became clearer. Her brothers spoke of San Francisco's growth, of investment opportunities and social positions. They offered to bring Eliza back with them, to give her what they called a proper life. "This is my proper life," Eliza said firmly. "Every sunrise earned, every sunset survived. You chose gold, I chose land and love and work that matters." Later, as her brothers bedded down in the spare room, Caleb found Eliza by the cottonwoods where it all began. The trees had grown tall and thick, their roots deep in the riverbank. "Regrets?" he asked, knowing her well enough to sense her mood. "No," she said, leaning into him. "Just thinking about paths. They went seeking fortune and found it. I came seeking a promise and found a life. Which is worth more?" She turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had aged alongside hers, weathered by the same storms, gentled by the same joys. "You know the answer to that." The next morning brought an unexpected addition to their reunion. An elderly woman stepped down from the stage, moving carefully but with purpose. It took Eliza a moment to recognize her missus, Sarah Carver, her mother, whom she'd believed dead these 15 years. "Mama," Eliza breathed, frozen on the porch. "Your brothers found me in Sacramento," Sarah said, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "I've been looking for you all for so long. After your father died, I remarried badly. When that ended, I didn't know how to find any of you." The reunion that followed was volcanic tears, recriminations, explanations, and finally, exhausted acceptance. Sarah Carver, now Sarah Mitchell, was welcomed with the same practical grace that had absorbed so many others into the Ward family orbit. Over the following days, as her family adjusted to ranch rhythms, Eliza watched her mother discover her grandson, watched her brothers slowly shed their city stiffness, watched Caleb manage it all with his quiet strength. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now overflowed with voices, arguments, laughter. "It's too much," Caleb confessed one evening, finding refuge with Eliza in the barn. "I'm not built for this much. People." "They'll leave soon," Eliza assured him. "Tommy's already itching for the city. James can't stop checking his pocket watch. Even Mama won't last a winter here." "And you're all right with that?" She considered. 20 years ago, I might have begged them to stay. Now I know you can't force roots. They either take or they don't." Her prediction proved accurate. After 2 weeks, her brothers departed with promises to write more often. Sarah stayed another month, helping with canning and trying to grandmother Jonah, who accepted her presence with the adaptability of frontier children. When she finally left for California, it was with tears but also relief. "I'm too old to learn new ways," she admitted. "But I'm grateful to see you settled. That promise you made as a child, we all thought it was foolishness." "The best things usually seem foolish at first," Eliza replied. As autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods in shades of gold that matched the memories, Eliza and Caleb took Jonah to the riverbank. It had become a tradition, visiting this spot where everything began. "Tell me again about the promise," Jonah demanded, skipping stones with increasing skill. So Eliza told him, as she had many times before, about a little girl who saw something worth waiting for and a man who waited without knowing he was waiting, about promises that seemed impossible but proved stronger than drought, loss, or time itself. "Will I make a promise like that someday?" Jonah asked. "Maybe," Caleb said, ruffling his son's hair. "But promises aren't magic, son. They're work, daily, constant work." "Like ranching?" "Exactly like ranching." As they walked home, Jonah running ahead with the boundless energy of childhood, Eliza felt the satisfaction of a life fully lived. The West had tested them with everything it had: weather, violence, loss, loneliness. They had survived not by being extraordinary, but by being stubborn, by choosing each other again each morning, by building something worth defending. The house came into view, smoke rising from the chimney, windows glowing in the late afternoon light. Tom Garrett, now foreman, waved from the corral. Miguel's grandson practiced roping nearby. The minister's wife had left a basket on the porch preserves, probably, or baby clothes for the newest family in town. "Regrets?" Caleb asked, echoing his question from days before, but meaning something larger. Eliza thought of the children never born, the easier paths not taken, the youth spent in hard labor and harder choices. Then she looked at Jonah's bright hair catching the sun, at Caleb's face lined with years of shared weather, at the home they'd built from a promise and stubbornness. "Not one," she said firmly. "Not even one." That night, she wrote in her journal, the same one she'd started 20 years ago. "The West teaches us that love isn't soft. It's tough as rawhide, persistent as sage, deep-rooted as cottonwoods by the river. It's choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, choosing to build when destroying takes less effort, choosing to hope when experience counsels otherwise." At 8, she kissed the cowboy by the river and said, "Wait for me." The miracle isn't that he waited, it's that both of them knew, even then, that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long the trail or hard the journey. Outside, the wind sang its ancient song across the grasslands, and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. But inside the ward house, laughter mingled with lamplight, and the promise made by a child 20 years ago continued to bear fruit not in fairy tale perfection, but in the deeper satisfaction of a life earned, a love tested, and a home that would shelter generations yet to come. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, perseverance, and promises kept in the American frontier. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across the miles, just like Eliza and Caleb did. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on their journey. Did their story touch your heart as it touched mine? Share your reflections below.